Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon along with the reference photo for color matching. If you're interested, check it out. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush because it's great for blocking in larger areas, though I am going to dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water and wipe off the excess. This will just help keep the paint wet for a little bit longer and aid our blending. With that, here we have our Mars Black, Titanium White, and Ultramarine Blue. I will put an image up on screen of all of the tubes so you can see the brand and all of that, but we're actually going to begin in the sky and work our way forwards. I'm not going to go in with a hyper saturated sky. I actually want something that's quite muted to reflect that of the reference photo. So I'm going to begin by grabbing quite a bit of our titanium white here, moving that to a clean spot on the palette. I'll grab about 1/10 that of Mars Black just with the corner of my brush, and we can take off any excess. And then we'll also grab about 1/10 of our ultramarine blue, and we're going in with very subtle amounts of both of these to start because it's a lot easier to darken this or make it more blue than it is to brighten it back up. So not a bad start. Let's double up our blue, and that right there looks pretty great. I'll just do a quick test on the photo. Looking good. And now we can apply this to the top, working predominantly in horizontal strokes, but I'll also work in a bit of an X-shaped pattern, and I am overlapping the drawing of my trees just a little bit. That way I can layer my trees over my sky and make it all look like it has proper depth. With that said, we are working with acrylics, so we will have to do this sky 2 or 3 times, just make sure we get a nice thick application, but I am going to let this dry before I go in and do the second layer. From there though, we will begin working on the trees. Now that we have our sky in there, we're going to head into this larger block of trees, but we're not going to start with the details. We're going to start with the larger gradient that you can see of a mid to dark gray, all the way up to a lighter gray. We're going to ignore all of the almost white highlights. They'll come a little bit later, but right now we just need to block in that background. Now I am going to be continuing with the 1-inch because it is quite a large area to block in, but we're going to go with something a bit darker. So I'll grab Mars Black, about 3 times what we used in this mixture, same amount of titanium white, and the same amount of our ultramarine blue. As you can see, looks quite dark relative to what we have here, but it's not actually all that dark. Do a little test in the reference photo, looks great. Pick up a bit more, and we'll head down to around the base. We'll draw in essentially all of our edging for it, and we'll do the foreground in a later step. But right now, we'll just cover the top. As you can see, we are going over the drawing. That's okay. You can always go ahead and redraw it using the reference photo, the traceable, or by just going back to the start of the video and seeing where all of it is. By the way, here I'm mixing up quite a bit of additional paint. Generally, I don't like to mix too much for our first application, just in case I don't end up loving it. But once it all works out, then we commit to significantly more. And I'll bring this up to about 1/3 of our larger area. Try to have quite a bit of pigment on there for further blending. I'll double up our titanium white. Mix it quite well so that we don't have some areas that are darker and some that are brighter. We'll apply that directly on top. We'll grab more, yet again, directly on top, but we don't want that hard line. We want a nice gradient, so in X-shaped patterns, I'm going to blend one up into the other. And this is generally the best way of just ensuring that we have a longer gradient. Just like that. And then we go over it softly to eliminate all of the brush strokes you've probably accrued through the larger blend. Now, as we continue to go up, we grab more titanium white, and we continue that same easy process. The first 8 minutes of this lesson, of this painting process, really are just painting these larger blocky backgrounds, but it's actually a great way to start. Gets you warmed up before we get into any of the detail work. It's also just really cathartic and fun to get these smooth blends. That said, as we start to move up to the top here, we're going to have to do something a little bit different, and that's start to craft where the trees are creating their top. So using my brush, I'm using the edge on the corner to distinguish where the trees are going to protrude, all of those little branches. Lots of tapping, as you can see. We'll grab more pigment eventually. It's going to almost match what we have on canvas. It'll become difficult to distinguish, but that's not a bad thing because we will be heightening it later with a brighter pigment and with darker branches. So we will get that separation, but once I've done that, I go back into my blend. Just make that nice and easy. There we go. Now I figured I'd get you a little bit closer just so you can see how I'm really dragging things down and upwards, then softening them. I'm going to do this a couple of times with the brighter pigment, just so that we have less of a stark turn from dark to light. And I also wouldn't mind if the majority of this was just a little bit brighter. So you can make these changes by keeping your brush damp through this process. You will make the blending process a lot easier. You'll be able to go back and work into other areas which would normally previously dry. We just don't want to work with too much water because it can make areas a little difficult to work with. So it's all about finding that balance. But I think that's pretty good. Once we have our larger background blocked in, we're going to switch to a fan brush, and this one actually has fairly stiff bristles. This will be fantastic for working on all of those darker gray little details that you can see in the background, and we'll slowly build the trees on top and then some highlights. Now, this process is actually going to begin with the 1-inch, just because it's a lot better at moving around and blending paint. But we essentially want something on the brighter side here. So we'll grab quite a bit of titanium white, about 2/10 Mars black, 2/10 ultramarine blue. We're mixing it on top of our previous mixture, just so we can see it in relation to what we've worked with. We'll do a little test. Needs to be slightly darker. A little more Mars black. We don't need too much blue in this, simply because we don't want it to become too overwhelming. But this right here is actually fantastic. We'll switch to the stiff bristled fan brush. This one isn't wet. We don't want it wet because we don't want to condense the bristles. But from there, we'll grab some of this pigment and we're going to start tapping this on and doing little drags in the general directions of the larger trees to be. So this step is going to look quite subtle at the very top, and then it's going to look a little bit awkward as we continue moving our way down, simply because it's the background. We're essentially adding details that we probably won't see, but it's going to give us the opportunity to leave openings with branches and leave openings with highlights. And in those openings, you're not just going to be staring at a flat gradient. So again, lots of little tap and drags, predominantly in the way that the branches are going to be moving. So we have a tree, it's coming up here, it's branching out this way. So we'll do lots of little taps. I'm not pressing hard with my brush, and we don't want to do that. because if we do, our bristles will start sticking together and we'll get much larger applications. We want to keep these nice and small. But here, as we get farther down, you can see that it looks brighter and brighter. Sometimes I'm doing a long stroke to mirror what would be a branch, and other times it's just a little tap to catch a highlight on a branch. Again, don't be disheartened when it looks awkward or not like anything at all, because at this point it really isn't meant to, and that's something we talk about in just about all of our acrylic paintings. Typically, it's a process of working through some silly portions visually, and then around that 80-90% finished area, it all comes together. It looks beautiful. You've seen the thumbnail, you know what this turns into. So if you trust me here, trust yourself, don't get discouraged, and just continue following along. With that, let's get you a little bit closer. So yet again, we'll start predominantly at the top. This is going to be a large tree right here, so it's essentially branching out to the left and right, and I'm just following the general movements of those branches. I like to kind of allocate all of the edges first, and then I start to move in. And you can also have a lot of these kind of crisscrossing with one another. Here you can see some larger markings because we have a bit more paint on our brush than we did previously. That's kind of inevitable as you continue with this brush because those bristles are going to condense eventually and make larger markings. We started on the right hand side so that we could get the really subtle ones because this tree here on the left is a little bit closer, so these markings in the background can be a bit more visually notable. That said, I'm not going to do too much in this bottom left corner because I want that to remain relatively dark. That way we get a slight vignette effect and the eye can be drawn into the painting. Here we're going for a bit of a connection. And I'm also going to be doing a bit of a tap with a rotated brush once we have almost no paint. And this is just going to give us a bit of filler pigment essentially. Again, most of this will be covered up later on in the painting process, but it will make the painting look a whole lot better in a subtle way that you don't really recognize unless you actually paint it. It's one of those fun little things. So we'll just finish this up. And I actually want quite a bit right down here. Again, lots of taps and drags as you move into the middle of the painting. We'll have it dissipate. So we have another gradient going on, except it's not a soft gradient, it's one of texture and detail. There we go. Now, once our canvas is fully dry, we're going to go back in and redraw on our trees. I tend to do said drawings with one of two different mediums. Here we have a woodless colored pencil and a Conte. Now, Conte is basically just a colored chalk, but it's great because once you've done that drawing, once you've done your painting and that painting is fully dry, you can take a wet brush, work it over the actual canvas, and that should take off the remaining Conte. So you don't have to worry about covering up all of your drawings. Alternatively, we can work with woodless colored pencils. Generally, that allows me to get a bit more of a fine marking, and as long as you don't press too hard with it, it's actually erasable, and these colors don't really normally dilute my other pigments that I'm working with the paint. So, two different options, really whatever works best for you, but I thought I'd let you know what I like to work with, and once that's sketched back on, we will head back into the painting. So now I have everything drawn, and I am going to switch to a filbert brush. This one's about 1/3 of an inch, but I really like working with this because it has a nice sharp top for details. It can pick up a decent amount of paint, and the corners are rounded for blending. That said, it'll be great for blocking in the base of our trees here. Now, the ones in the foreground are going to be quite dark, but still have a touch of blue because we're going to have a lot of reflective light, and a lot of that is going to be blue. So I start with quite a bit of Mars black, maybe 1/6 that, titanium white. We'll grab maybe 1/6 that ultramarine blue. These, by the way, are fully dry, so I'm not too worried about working with those. And now, I'm going to find my edges first and start to work this on. It's worth noting that my brush is currently damp, so I just dipped it in a little bit of water, then wiped off the excess, and I did that so that I could get a nice sharp application so that the bristle is condensed, and so that the paint stayed wet again for a little bit longer. But as per usual, as you move up our tree, we want it to get smaller and smaller. So what I tend to do is apply less pressure with my brush, because the more pressure you apply, the more your bristles tend to spread out on the canvas, and we don't want that. So I'm going in very lightly, and this is about as small as I can get it with this brush. So at this point, I'm going to fill in that larger negative space, maybe adjust the shape of my tree minorly, and we'll move on to the next tree. The smaller branches will all be covered with a different brush, which we'll grab in just a minute. I'd also like to note that when I'm painting a lot of the bodies of these trees, I'm not really going in with singular applications. I like to make a line, take my brush off the canvas, make another one, take brush off, another one, and this is just going to give it a lot more of an organic look, more natural look than if we just took the brush and went all the way down. Often, trees have little areas that protrude and stick out, and we want to incorporate that in the painting process. So here you can see I'm just going back over that one where I kind of did in the lazy singular fashion and added in all of those extra strokes. From there though, we'll need a bit more paint. So again, Mars black, about a 1/6 titanium white, 1/6 ultramarine blue, at least for the trees here in the foreground. And the trees in the foreground are on the far left and right hand side. As you move towards the center, they get farther away, and we'll make those a bit softer looking with a different mix. But I think this one is also close enough to us that we can paint it. And then after this one, we'll switch our brush and our mix just a little bit as well. But we can frame the painting with these applications and this brush. If you accidentally make a portion of the tree larger on the top than it is in the middle or the bottom, then we're going to just make the middle and the bottom slightly more thick. There we go. Easy fix. And we can go back and adjust previous trees, as the singular layer with a damp brush often will be a little bit too thin, and multiple layers will make it look a bit more professional as we come towards the end. That said, let's switch our brush. So now we're a little bit closer, and we have our liner brush. This one is quite small, fantastic for those details. Like all of our other brushes, I'm going to dip it in a little bit of water, wipe off the excess, and we'll go to that same mixture that we were working with. I was talking about switching to a different mixture, but we do need to finish out these trees, and that'll be best achieved with what we currently have. That way it's all nice and natural. We're still going to try to make all of our branches get larger as you move towards the bottom. I'm still using quite a damp brush. Still trying to make these branches with lots of little strokes rather than singular elongated ones. Though, I'm using quite a bit of water, and so branches like that end up being quite transparent. Not necessarily a bad thing. It makes it look a little bit more distant, and trees, of course, you're going to have branches that come out to the sides, that go back, and the ones that go back, they might look a bit more distant. So I don't actually dislike that at all. It can be a nice touch. And an unintended one, but a good one. Now here, we're just going to continue trying to diversify our trees. I'm following the reference photo for the most part, but I'm also taking artistic liberties and making it my own. Something I haven't done a lot of, but I'm about to do, is crossing branches. That is a huge part of making all of this look natural. You're always fighting the battle of ensuring that it doesn't look messy when you do this, but it is something that's very necessary, and I think something that a lot of people are initially a little apprehensive about endeavoring in. But it's a really important part of it. Something you also want to do is ensure that all of your branches are moving in the same direction. You really want as much diversity as you can achieve in here. I'm just looking at the reference photo again, and you know what? I think there's another larger branch coming off of this. That'll make this and this a bit more different, which I like. And then I can cut through here and become, yet again, smaller applications. I'm running out of pigment, which is actually really nice as I get towards the top because it makes them more semi-transparent. And you're just not going to see those harder dark values as you get towards the smaller branches, just because the light's going to wrap around them to a much greater degree. When you have a larger subject like this, there's a lot of surface area for that light to wrap around and not, fully get around. But when you have the smaller branches like this, light can really work its way through it. And you can do a little test of that if you have a small brush, right? And then something much larger that's in a cylindrical shape. Hold that around light, you'll notice the much larger item has a much greater shadow on the back of it than something like a brush. Again, it's dependent upon your lighting, but generally that's what you'll find. It's important to recognize these things so that when you do want to work with your imagination more in painting, rather than using reference photos and traceables and all of that, you can kind of come to these distinctions yourself and ensure that your piece looks nice and natural. Something else I'm doing, which is going to be a little bit tricky, and I'll explain why in a second, is creating this arching pattern that's going to work its way back. Why is that tricky when we've been doing all of these other branches? Simply because we want to instigate this very particular movement while not just creating a bunch of long curved strokes, right? Because that would be easy. We could do that, but it wouldn't look great. So let's start to disrupt it a little bit. Let's have a branch work through there, come back to there. And I know we've been painting branches now for about 5 minutes, but we do need a lot of them. Again, this is what's really at the heart of the painting. We're going to cover up a lot of them with snow and ice, but for now, we need that base in here. Occasionally I am doing a bit of a softer, more rounded application, but it's all about finding that balance. I'm also feeling incredibly compelled to do these, but I know it's not the right time because we're going to need to make the pigment less stark and a little bit more blue there as you move into the distance. There we go. We're getting to the point where we have a very full spot, but realistically still not enough branches, right? You have hundreds of thousands on a tree this size, where, you know, we probably haven't painted 100, but we need to create the implication of them. Recognize that the smallest ones won't really be seen, but we do want to create smaller and smaller little pieces. We're still going to want to let portions of the snowy trees show through. So again, it's all about balance. Something I tend to do with a lot of my painting subjects is I don't overdo anything. I almost always underdo everything. And then in that final 10 to 15% of the painting, I come back and I add until I get as much as I want. That way I've seen the painting with too little, and then I work the painting until I have exactly how much I want. Or I purposefully overwork it a little bit so I can see what too little looks like and what too much looks like, so I know very definitively what just the right amount looks like. Here, still lots of crisscrossing. I don't have much pigment on my brush, so these branches are very semi-transparent, which is fantastic when we don't want to overdo the look or aesthetic. This is great for right now, and when it's done, I think I will start to move on to other trees. There we go. There's definitely, you know what, I say that? I was going to say there's definitely more we can do. I really want to put a smaller tree right down here. We'll make that a bit more original, multiple strokes, a couple larger branches. We can always go back and do this, but again, I think it was just very notable that this area was in need of something. There we go. And you know what, we'll do another one right down here. Much more subtle. It's a bit farther away. There we go. Really relaxed process. Lots of branch making. Get the hang of it, and then it's just a really enjoyable, calming experience. There we go. Lots of crisscrossing at the bottom. Let's move over to the side though. Now we're going to do this next part from a little bit of a distance here, very purposefully, because it's so easy to get caught up in the details when working on something like this and create unbalanced areas where you have significantly more detail in one area than another, and then you kind of have to make the choice of, well, am I going to even that out by adding significantly more detail to an area where I didn't want it, or do I paint over all of that detail that I have with the original background and then kind of redo that area? And of course, all of that can easily be solved by just taking these steps back in the painting process and painting from a little bit of a distance. Something else you can do if you find that you're starting to create these same lines and effects over and over, that it's starting to look a little bit monotonous and not necessarily all that natural, is you can hold your brush from farther back. I think typically people like to hold their brushes like that, but the farther back you go, the more loose your brush strokes typically are, the less control you have, and so you get something that's a little bit more messy, though when painting nature, often that's actually a great thing. It introduces a little bit of randomization and spontaneity into the applications, which is something we really do want. So, we'll just go ahead and continue making our branches. Going over this a couple of times because, again, watery, that is a necessary part of this. trying to cover up my drawing for the most part, but I'm also not afraid to deviate a little bit, as we can take the drawing off later, and we're just going to get a better feel for what the painting can look like as we actually paint it, right? Like, we have an idea in our head, we can see the reference photo, we can see the traceable, but as we actually start applying paint, we find areas that we have preference for, that we like a little bit better, that we might want to prioritize and enhance, and therefore other areas we'll want to simplify. And that's something that we're continuously doing, and something that's, again, a lot easier to do when we take these steps back. Something else I'm doing is around these areas where I do have a bit of a larger branch. I use next to no pressure at the top, and then as I get in closer, I start to apply more and more, and then I get those nice, large, thicker strokes. Just like that. Again, we're painting a lot of branches. You'll have a good amount of practice. And by the end of this, I think it'll just be a really fun process. There we go. I look on the viewfinder of the camera, and it tells me how long I've essentially been doing this for. And I'm always surprised, just because I enjoy it a lot, and it always feels a lot shorter than it actually is. And then I try to paint a little bit faster so that you don't have to watch the same thing, or rather me painting the same thing for an extended period of time. But and I think, well, you know what, I'm really enjoying it. So you probably are too. At least I would hope so. There we go. Try to interject as much information as I can through the process so that while you may be watching a similar process, you're still gathering new information in the video. Now here, I'm running into not necessarily an issue, but something to watch out for. This top area is quite thick, and I wanted my trees to end where that initial tapped, moved process was. So I'm going to start deviating these branches left and right so it gives me more time to make them smaller. Because if we continuously went up, they'd have to condense very quickly, right? Don't want that. It would look unnatural. So here, I'm taking it to the right. Therefore, I have a greater length to make it smaller and smaller so that it feels more natural like the rest of my branches. There we go. It's definitely working out. Might get a little bit quiet as I think about this here. Started to make almost the exact same branch underneath unintentionally. Probably because that one worked out so well. In my head it was like, okay, well, we'll do that again. But we don't actually want to mirror that, right? So now I'll deviate my strokes, go in a couple of different directions. Almost have no actual paint on my brush right now, so we'll work on the smaller branches, which will of course be more semi-transparent. We also want just little sticks that are breaking off of our pre-established branches. And this is all going to add up to a nice backing tree, which we will of course cover with snow and ice, as you saw in the reference photo and in the thumbnail and the little preview at the start of the video. Try to give you a good idea of what we're going to do, because acrylics, they can look a little silly initially. They can take some time to really form and become something great. And having that confidence in the potential outcome is just, it's important. I think confidence in painting is really something that can elevate a painting, make you paint a lot more, make you paint better. And establishing that confidence comes with learning. I think understanding why things are painted a certain way rather than just how they're painted, but also practice. So try to pick that brush, have some fun fairly frequently. Do have a couple hundred lessons on the channel now at this point. And I am thinking quite a lot about restarting the 10-minute paintings as a secondary series for the channel. That way there's something a bit more quick that you can endeavor in for days where you want to create something, where you're inspired, but you don't necessarily have the time to create a piece that's going to be as complex as this one. So look out for that, and if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. That's something I don't think I've said in probably 100 videos, but it's a great way of just keeping up with the channel and making sure you get to see all of the new paintings, the new series, all of that good stuff. I could honestly just paint these forever. It's a lot of fun, easy to get lost in. But I recognize that we have more to paint. So for now, that's great. I'm happy. What we're going to do is we're going to start moving into this intersection with a slightly different mix. Now we'll get a little closer and start working on the interior trees here, though we're going to go with something less stark than our previous mixture, though I will begin with the Mars Black. We'll double up the amount of titanium white we were using in the previous mixture, and we'll also double up our ultramarine blue, because as the trees get farther back here, we'll see a bit more shadow. You don't really have as much light on them, and therefore you'll get more of a color that fits well with the atmosphere. So I think that'll work quite well. We're just mixing it up to the point where we don't have little blotches of blue, titanium white, or Mars Black. Now I'll grab some extra water, clean that brush so that we don't have an abundance and we can make those smaller, sharper lines. Grab that, and we will yet again craft some trees that will get larger as we come towards the bottom. So pressing more with our brush, as you know. Pressing extremely soft right here. Branches are looking very visually samey, so I'll try to elaborate on them a bit more. I only drew in the more prominent pieces of the branches, because again, these just have so many movements and so much line work that in the sketching process you really just need to focus on the larger trees that will dictate composition, and then in the painting process we elaborate. But because we're not drawing all of it on initially, we need to go into the later applications with some good foresight, be careful, and just ensure we're doing the best job we can. I'll also start doing some over on the left-hand side. Again, making sure they're nice and crisscrossing, having different widths. We do want that full arch effect. So while I have a lot of wet pigment on my brush, I'll start at the top, because it's really easiest to render sharp, small lines when you have fresh, watery paint. The more I apply this, of course, the harder it will get to apply with intention. So we get those smaller applications out of the way, and then as we run out of paint, inevitably, we press harder as we have to, and we create those larger branches. That said, I think this is all actually going really, really well. Love how it's turning out. You can see just how small and faint the trees are getting in the background. I am purposefully making them smaller, even through the body, as you move into the distance. It's a relatively simple composition and a subject that you've probably seen 100 times. Maybe you've painted it a couple as well. But it's one of those things where you can really improve on it over time as you understand the subject and how to diversify, how to change the depth. So I like to do a scene like this at least once a year. And I always notice some real improvement. Again, it's not a complicated thing, but there are a lot of little niche pieces that accumulate and will help you become a better painter over time. So just something fun to track yearly and continue to get better at. You can see I'm really going over a number of these watery applications quite a few times. And this middle portion, we're going to end with a lot of crisscrossing branches. There we go. Trying to make some that are a little bit less expected. Some that kind of break the general mold and direction. That's a bit more stark. I think that actually added a lot to it. I like that. Again, we'll cover a lot of it up with snow, but these initial applications and markings will ensure that the final piece is nice, complete, and significantly more realistic. At this point, I'm just kind of filling in the backgrounds because we have the most faint branch pigment yet. And we have an opportunity that we didn't have before. So I'm just looking for the widest openings, the areas that look like empty negative space, where it won't get overly complicated. You can dodge your previous drawings, or you can work over it if it's dark enough that it isn't noticeable. But I think that worked out really, really well. Once all of the branches are fully dry, we can start working on the highlights that you can see predominantly at the top, and then we'll work our way downwards, and we can try to do so with a variety of different brushes. So here with the snow, we're actually going to start with the same liner brush we've been using. We're going to grab quite a bit of a titanium white, move that to a clean spot on the palette. This is dried, so it's clean enough. We'll grab maybe 1/10 of that, maybe less, of our ultramarine blue, and the same with the Mars black, wiping off the excess. You want something that's almost white, but not quite. You want to give it room to be highlighted, a small amount for true highlights, but something that is significantly and definitively brighter than everything else that we've previously worked with. Now, when I go into this, I'm going to take my pinky finger, ground it on the canvas, and then I go for what's initially a lot like a rounded stroke in the general direction of the branch and the tree, leaving openings where you can see the branch and, in addition, the negative space underneath. However, the top area here is going to be receiving a lot of light, so that snow is going to be extra bright at the top, and there's going to be less negative space in between our strokes, where as we get farther and farther down, we're going to be moving into more shadowy areas, and therefore we're going to have more of that showing through. There's less light highlighting all of that snow and giving it this really beautiful illuminated look. Now, these strokes aren't all that long, and I want to show you initially all of this from a bit of a distance, but I'll move you up now so you can see what the strokes actually look like up close. So here we are, quite a bit closer, and you can see I'm making these strokes which are wrapping this way because we're on the right hand side of the tree, but as we go towards the left hand side of the tree, I will start wrapping them the other way. And the idea here is that these are just the ends of thousands of little branches that are sticking up and are covered in snow or ice. And painting them with this individual little brush is a great way of commanding detail and form. You can really have all of your decisions refined. However, an issue that can occur through this application is that we again just make things a little too visually samey. That's a problem that can come up in a lot of different elements of painting, especially landscapes. And there are a couple ways around that, but typically we just use other brushes. So, what we can do is kind of bounce back and forth from different kinds of brushes. You instill the markings that you feel you need and that really define the top in a way that you want. And then we can go back in with something like a fan brush or a 1 inch that's kind of peeled back, a 1/2 inch that's kind of peeled back, anything really square-headed. And we can make it a lot more interesting. Though you can see that I am continuously going over different areas, and there's a little bit of texture in these as well. I'm using a lot of paint, not a lot of water. That way it physically sticks up off of the canvas. Just like that. You don't have to paint and make it textured. And acrylics do generally shrink to about 1/3 of the texture that you apply, the size. But you can get some. And it can be a nice look without having to work with oils and the smell they produce, as well as the dry time. That said, let's move a little bit farther back and I'll show you how I work with other brushes as well. So here we are, a little bit farther back. I still have quite a bit of paint here on my palette that was pre-mixed with the liner brush, but I'm switching to the fan brush. Again, stiff bristles, purposefully going with this one not wet and without any mixing. That way the bristles stand fairly far apart. But we'll grab that. And then we can make just so many little randomized markings. Normally, when I paint foliage with this brush, I do a very simple tap, nothing else. However, I am doing a bit of a drag, and it's only a couple millimeters, but it's going to give us that look of there being branches, and this just being on the ends of them. Now, each of your taps is going to look a little bit different. And I'm very purposefully rotating my brush so that different elements of the bristles are pressing on the canvas. This is just going to give us something that's a bit more continuously unique. It will look more messy. But again, different ways of going about it, depending upon how you want it to look. If you're finding the other is a little too visually samey. As I get towards the center area, I do just move into more of a tap. It's far away to the point where you're not going to see the tops of your branches, and therefore that detail that we want to render here, specifically in the front, top left and right, isn't necessary, and in fact will be a bit of a detriment to the lesson or to the finished painting, right? So here, just going in with these taps, might do noticeable little arches And I can tell that we're about to go off camera, so I won't go any farther down than that. But we'll do some extra taps here. And again, for me, I really like the combination of the two. You don't have to start with the top liner brush applications. You can begin with this. And here you can see I'm back to doing the little drags. But I think I'll use the remainder of the pigment that I have in this mix on the side here. And then I'll go and do the top again with the liner brush. Bring it down here, do a slight blend. It wasn't just at the top, we did get little areas that were down here. That way we have a natural transition and gradient of textures. That's important for making it look natural. And especially with these larger branches that extend, it may be in the middle, but it's connected to a tree that's in the foreground to the right. So we want to ensure that that definitely has those same applications, because at this point, that's essentially what I'm allocating for foliage, or not foliage, but branches that are very close to us. And the tap is more so for ones that are farther away with some obvious overlap. There we go. That said, let's get you a little bit closer for that top area again. So here we are, nice and close. You can see our previously created gray top to this with the filbert brush. Now we're going to make it look a bit more clean, a bit more tidy again. Going to that liner brush, grabbing some pigment, starting at the very top. And now, because we're working on trees to the left-hand side of the canvas, all of my applications on the left-hand side are going to start tall, and then they're going to dip inwards. This is, again, only going to be a couple millimeters in terms of actual distance of stroke. However, if you're working on a larger canvas, you're going to probably want to make it a little bit bigger. Something to always consider, the size of the canvas that you work on and the size of the details, because when you work on a smaller canvas, you are limited to a point with the amount of detail you can incorporate, interject, and therefore you intentionally should simplify some subjects so that they look natural. But when you are presented with a larger canvas and you have a greater opportunity for detail, that's when we decide to pick previously simplified areas and make them not simplified, right? I know that there's a lot of light in here. It's not necessarily the easiest to see, but we actually want that. It creates this really interesting effect where when we step back and we look at it, there's just so much going on up here, but it doesn't look busy or unnatural. It just looks very naturally layered. There are slight little details, but nothing that's too eye-catching to the point where it's distracting or difficult to look at. And it's all about creating that balance, right? Again, creating less distance in between these taps and strokes at the very top, and then more as we progressively work downwards, because A, it's brighter at the top, but B, you can see more layered branches in front of each other, so you're not getting those shadows in behind like what we have right down here. And this is, again, where we start to refine some of those taps that we did with the liner brush. You can create clusters of branches, should you want to. You can work it onto actual previously painted branches. There we go. And really start to make the piece your own, a little bit less randomized. And again, I'm still painting with some texture, but not too much. I'm being relatively quick, and if you are finding things are too visually samey, you can hold your brush from farther back. I noted that I am being relatively quick with my taps and my applications just because I wanted to know that it isn't all hyper methodical. I'm purposefully working quickly so that I don't get too in my head about it and therefore render the same thing over and over again. I'm even missing the canvas some of these times just because I am so loose with my application. I think that can give it a really natural look. Now, I didn't finish this bottom area earlier because it was being cut off by the camera, but we have our fan brush, we have some pigment, so now we can come down here and again work through that arch. A lot of this is being arched, so I'm working from one side to the other along hypothetical branches. I'm also going to fill in some of the negative space that we have on the left and right, a little bit over the actual trees. We can do some falling snow if we want to in the top, which would add a little bit more context to some of the really small applications that might just be circular or feel like they're falling over the larger trees. That's something that you can decide on later, and I probably will towards the end of the painting. We'll just see how everything feels and fits. But we do that, we'll put that brush down, mix one more time for this. Again, significantly more titanium white. We'll create those individual little branches, and we can also follow previous branches, just the tops of them, the larger ones, to show that we have some ice there, some fallen snow. It'll allow us to overlap, create those really natural divots in between. I like that a lot. There we are. And we're just trying to make sure that it's all well spread out. Maybe do more prominent ones through here. I think that'll help a lot. And we'll do some little break-off branches in there as well. Have them crisscrossing as we know we need. And we can also jump back into the taps where we feel it necessary. But you can really see how important the layering process is in this. We went from something very simple to very textured and layered. So here we are, a little bit farther back, and at this point I think it's worth noting that we are at about the hour mark in our lesson, and the painting itself still looks a little messy, right? We definitely need to extend some of our branches, we need to highlight the tops of this better, we need to differentiate some of the branches. There's a lot to do that can make this quite elevated, and so don't get discouraged if you're at this point. If you're working on another painting and you're at that hour mark and you're saying, wow, I've spent an hour on this, it should be great. It's just part of acrylics. It's just parts of layering. I know I say it in every lesson, but I just think it's so important to continue to reiterate because it's easy to get frustrated when things aren't looking amazing from the beginning. But it's meant to look like this at this point. You've seen the thumbnail. It'll look better, and so will yours. So, with that, we're going to do a couple of things. The first is interject some true highlights towards the top and even extend portions of the top. For that, I'm going to be working with my liner brush. Make sure it's nice and damp. We'll grab some titanium white, and we'll mix in a new clean spot on the palette. This is all dried, but I am going to want a hint of Mars Black, a hint of ultramarine blue. We're still not going in with a pure titanium white, but this is definitely going to be the closest to it than anything else we've worked with. See, that was our previous highlight. And now we're going to go up even higher. And we're purposefully working above our old workspace. That way we have that blue sky, that muted blue sky, showing through. And it's going to create some extra depth for us. It's going to make the trees look a bit more three-dimensional. I'm going in with a lot of that tap and drag effect that we have been working throughout the majority of this lesson. And this is where that snow is really going to start looking nice, where it's going to have that shine on it, some light. I am working it down into our previous mixture, as you can see, though not absolutely everywhere, still leaving openings. And as I get farther and farther down, I want to reestablish more clusters, things of that nature. I'm also going back up over top of our previous applications of it and thickening some of them, because working with a fairly watery brush to get the smaller, sharper strokes, and in the process we are of course thinning that paint, letting the background, which isn't as bright, show through, and making the current layer, once dry, appear darker than what it looks like when we apply it, or what it looks like on our palette. It's always important to consider the pigment that's right under the one you're using, because unless your new pigment is incredibly thick and opaque, you know, when you use next to no water and the pigment itself is inherently thick, you're going to see that undercolor show through. And that's often why we build so many layers, so that undercolor actually becomes the color you're using to a large extent, fixing that problem. But it isn't always a problem. Often, seeing the undercolors can add a really great look. It can make a piece feel cohesive. It can build atmosphere. It can actually do a lot of good. Now here, I need to mix up a bit more paint. Again, incredibly minute amounts of our Mars Black and our Ultramarine Blue, taking off excess, and if I add too much of either, I go back and I grab a lot more Titanium White, work that into my mixture, trying to move my thumb so you can see all of it. And then we go back to the canvas for these applications. That said, let's get you a little bit closer, yet again, as you like to do, so we can see it as a whole. We can also see that detail in the brush strokes forming. So here, up close, we can really see the difference between that added highlight and an area that simply doesn't have it. Makes a big difference. Now, over here, what I would like to do is change my shape a little bit of the top of the tree, something you definitely can do, and even extend little areas of presumed branches. And I'd like to just kind of act here as if we have some leading lines bringing us into the painting. I'm also considering the height of the application on the left-hand side of the canvas, and I'm making sure this is slightly shorter so that we have different areas and it doesn't just become monotonous. We want to ensure that it's continuously visually interesting, and that diversity is one of the primary ways of achieving that. That said, here I am still going over a lot of my blue sky initially, and then we work our way back down. A lot of this is, again, as if we are following individual, incredibly small branches. And we do want this to work its way into the center, as the center is still an extension of the trees that we have on the left and the right hand side, which are our foreground, our most detailed subject. and our subjects with the greatest contrast. And I think an area this could easily get a little awkward or off pace is not connecting the center area through highlight. So we'll make sure to do that, but in the process continue to lead the center area back into the larger trees which it actually comes from. There we go. Also, continuously going back up to the top, taking little breaks from it, just making sure that we're not overdoing it. And then I come back down here, and as we add more down here, it becomes more apparent as to what we can do up there. We can also, again, highlight the tops of branches. You want predominantly elongated ones that work more horizontally than vertically, because more snow will be able to hold on them to a greater degree. And this is just something we do occasionally. Don't do too much of it, but it can help and it can look nice over time. That said, this is something that we don't want to overdo, and we can only really tell if we're doing the right amount when we take those steps back. So, we'll just finish up these taps and we'll gather some distance. So just like that, one extra technique, and I think it's already looking a whole lot better, and there's more we can do. But before we move on, I do think it's important to know why we did, what we were attempting to accomplish, and what we did, so you can incorporate that in future lessons, not just this one. We essentially added that highlight to incorporate more depth, right? We now have more levels, so we go from the brightest brights to the darker darks. We feel like more light is working its way around the top, and then it's having difficulty as it's moving down into the bottom areas, as they are going to naturally have more shadows because there's more branches, more things to stop that light from moving in. So we have more volume, we have more depth. The highlight itself looks significantly more natural. It looks a lot more like snow actually would on a rather bright day. We also covered up a lot of the smaller branches, which you would want to actually be painted smaller, but because of the canvas size restriction, we just can't do that. So we end up covering up a lot of it, making them implied. Fact that there, are some in here, but we just can't see them because they're too small, they're too far away. So we added to the realism by actually taking away subjects or hiding subjects, something that's actually very beneficial when you're not working on giant, 24 by 36 inch canvases. And so there are a lot of different things you can do, and they are all going to depend on the size of your canvas and what brushes you're working with. But adding volume, adding more of those natural pigments to build up, because the first layer is going to be an amalgamation of, again, what you have on your palette and what's already there, and therefore not what you actually want. And covering up things that you can't technically, physically paint in, so you create the implication of it instead. Those are the larger thoughts. But with that, we are going to now start working on finding some of the trees in here. We covered up the majority of the bodies with snow because we're going to have branches that, not only move to the left and right, but come towards us, right? And we wanted that snow, that ice on top of them. But there are going to be more bare areas in different trees, and I'd like to reestablish some of those. So yet again, still working with the liner brush, we'll grab our Mars Black, and I still have the darker pigment from the foreground trees right up here on my palette, it's not wet, but I can mix right beside it so that I get the exact same pigment or something very, very similar. Alternatively, you can test on your reference photo. Again, I just kind of keep mine up there so I can continuously glance back and forth, see if I'm kind of making the right decisions or if I'm deviating where I want to. But now I can tell that this tree right here in the reference photo isn't all that covered towards the bottom. It's not an older tree, therefore it doesn't have that many branches. Therefore, we don't have something sticking out through the bottom here and making it covered. We also have an opening in this tree right here. There we go. This tree right here, this branch right here, not the entirety of the tree. And we can even add smaller branches that we didn't have before. You can work some up into the top. Again, I'd be careful because the implication of those branches can be far more valuable than the actual branches in a lot of scenarios. But there are a couple of spots where we can splash those in should we want to. I also have smaller liner brushes that we can and probably will work with. But I wanted to show you what it's like when you do feel slightly limited by the tools that you have, because that is a very real thing. And to an extent, regardless of the tools we have, we are going to be limited, right? So this is just a very realistic approach, way of going about it. I don't want these to be too stark at the top, or the bottom really either. But again, redefining openings. This tree seems to have quite a lot of open space, so we will have fun with that. And by doing so, by keeping some with a lot of that foliage or, branches in front of it, and some without, we further add to that diversity in a pretty dramatic way. Something we're consistently looking to do. Do need to mix up a bit more of my paint. Often, as a standard rule, I don't mix up too much of a pigment in the beginning of working on a subject, just in case it's not actually the pigment that I want. Often editing a large amount is a little trying. So I mix small amounts to begin with, give it a go, and if it's what we want, then we mix a lot more. If it isn't, and often it isn't, I remix, retry, and then when I have what I really want, then we go for it. Having a lot of fun with this. Realistically, what we're painting here, what we spent the last hour painting here, could be done in 15 minutes. But by taking our time, we're doing it a whole lot better. And that variance in quality often can be noted. That said, I do like to do quick paintings. I do want to re-interject the 10-minute paintings on this channel, because I think it's important to not be afraid of the canvas and always feel like you're endeavoring into something grand. Often we just don't have the time to do a 4-hour lesson, and just doing something quick can be really good for keeping those skills up, having fun, not worrying too much about it, and just doing those general studies can be really advantageous. So what I'm really trying to get at here is it's good to do a balance of, taking something that could be done in 15 minutes and doing it in an hour and a half, and taking that same thing and doing it in 15 minutes. right? You learn different lessons from them. You get different results. I think that we have different goals with them as well. So the whole idea here is that neither of which is bad or good. Well, they're both good. Neither of which is bad, though. It's really just about what you want to accomplish in that given day. There we are. I'll admit that I recently woke up. It's about 7 in the morning right now. And still kind of waking up a little bit. But I woke up and I just felt really inspired to start painting this again. So here we are. Perhaps a little more silly than usual, but hopefully that just makes it fun. Trying to incorporate some more unique branches. And we can incorporate additional snow on top of them if we want to. But we don't have to. There we are. I like that one a lot. I think it's really starting to come together here. And, as noted previously, still quite a bit to do. So it's all quite exciting. There we are. Okay. I think I'm going to take a break from this just so that I don't overdo it. We can always go back and add more, but I'll show you the reference photo and our next step for now. Instead of working on what we have to the left and right hand side, we're actually going to do the road first because we want to layer quite a bit of this on top of the road. It's very notable right through here, and it's just going to make the whole process a whole lot easier. But the road does have extensions, as you can see right through here behind some of the trees, and it's also slightly behind there. So we're going to cover up portions of our previously painted areas, and then we'll relayer the trees over where necessary. But it'll just give it a much more natural look if we do go through this larger layering process. Now, to paint the road and the ground that surrounds it, we're going to be going back to the 1/3 inch filbert brush because it can carry quite a bit more paint, and again, it's really good for diverse applications. Now, I'm going to start with the sides, and this is going to be about a medium gray, so I'm starting with that titanium white, finding a fairly clean spot on the palette, and we'll probably start with about 4/5 titanium white to Mars black. Do a little test on the reference photo. Looks a little bit dark there, but we're going to give it a shot here, and I do think it is a little bit dark. So we'll increase that titanium white. Again, that's why we don't mix a massive amount of paint in the very beginning, just in case we do want to edit it. Nice and bright there. We will, of course, need just a hint of our ultramarine blue as well. Make it nice and cool. Good for the shadowy areas, and this is down at the bottom, so it will have shadows on it. Again, I'll do a little test, and that looks fantastic. So, let's try to recreate that right back here. I will use the sharp edge of my brush to work my way in between a number of these distant trees. Just like so. Nice and easy. We can repaint the base of these trees as well, so it's nothing to worry too much about if you end up overlapping them. And I'm also not going for a straight line across. You can see that there are slight divots and changes. I'll also take this same pigment and We're going to continue the road all the way up here, so I might as well cover that up, but then we move to the right, and I need a bit more water. I do want this to be semi-transparent because I want some of that darker background showing through just so it feels nice and natural. Doesn't feel too bright. We're going to keep the road a bit brighter because there's more so of an opening in the trees in the center, and therefore more light can move down and brighten that spot. A little bit of finger painting, never really get too old for that. And then we'll just finish off the edge here, but the majority of that will be covered in a slightly later step. So, really like what we have there. Good base. Now, let's start working on the road. I'm going to take all of that pigment off of my brush, and we are going to switch to the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it is quite large. Make sure that's nice and damp. And then there are areas for tire tracks on both sides of the road. I want those to be quite a bit darker. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Mars Black, about an equal mixture of titanium white, so darker mixture, just like that. And I'm going to use this, just looking at my reference photo, to cover the entirety of the road. We'll start in the foreground and then slowly work our way back and forth. Starting to run out of paint, and I don't want to just get a very chalky look, so I'll make sure my brush is damp and we'll grab more paint, but we'll also mix more paint because I didn't have too much to begin with. Wasn't sure if I'd like that. And I'll also make it a little bit darker as we progressively move back, because I can see in the reference photo that it's a bit more open towards the back. You can see through more of the snow and see the actual road in that area. So we'll just get a little bit more contrast, which isn't normally how one works into the background. Normally you have your larger amount of contrast, and we'll go up to about there. Normally you have the majority of your contrast and your saturation in the foreground, more of your innate coloring and all of that. But here, it's a little bit different. That's why I do like to work with reference photos. They tell me things that I wouldn't inherently think of. Because often, while there are rules, there are reasons to break them. So, now we have the base to a road we will soon cover. You can use a little bit of the darker pigment, by the way, on the left and the right hand side. This is just going to give it a slight vignette effect. Vignettes are used to draw the eye in towards the center of any piece because the eye innately goes to the brightest point. And this will just make that center area a little bit brighter, though we are covering up the vast majority of it. That said, we do need to let all of this dry before we start adding the snow on, so I'm going to give that probably 10 minutes. In that time frame, we will clean our brushes and water dish quite well. That way we ensure that we can continue working with nice, clean tools, materials, all of that good stuff. So, I will see you in just a second. Now our road is fully dry to the touch, so I'm going to take my filbert brush, again about 1/3 of an inch. We'll create a very bright, nice snowy pigment, similar to what we used at the tops of the trees. We use a little bit of our ultramarine blue, a little bit of our Mars black, but really, predominantly, this mixture will be titanium white heavy. And again, we mix up small amounts because we may want to make drastic changes, and I'm just taking a little bit of that previous pigment, and now we can do a good switch. So, it has room to get brighter, which is important. We'll take off the excess, make our brush a little bit damp. And again, I have two areas where essentially tires are going to leave marks on the road. That is not going to be in the center. So I'm going to start in the center and I'll move my brush left, right, then vertically. You can see the almost black showing through a good portion of this, which is actually a nice thing because it means we can build this up over time. The road is going to move down like this, and then we're going to get to an interesting place where we're no longer looking downhill, but rather we start to get a perfectly horizontal look. So this will expand as it gets closer to us. It'll also start moving towards the left as a whole. And then we'll have a bit of movement that goes like this. And that'll expand greatly again as we move towards the true foreground. So, we're essentially making it larger because perspective will make subjects appear larger in the foreground. We'll go over it a couple of times. It looks so narrow here in the middle because we are only going to see a small portion of it when it's horizontal, right? You see a lot more of the road when it's downhill. And we do need to expand this greatly because it needs to be significantly larger than what we have at the top here. So, we'll continue that process. And this additional layer is going to make it look a lot better covered. Though I'm not going to cover all of it perfectly. I want some areas to be a little bit brighter and a little bit darker. That way it looks like there's different amounts of snow and slightly different highlights in said snow. Then we'll grab more water, grab more pigment. We're going to go over to the left-hand side, or right-hand side. That's inverted, at least in the viewfinder. So I will cover this up. You can see we're leaving a little area for the eventual tire tracks. We're not actually going to leave it that dark. And then we'll go up to the top, bring this down, and just cover that up. It's going to look, admittedly, fairly unprofessional for a little bit, as our pigment is quite thin and we're using quite a watery mix there. But here we can go in with a lot more paint. Again, making that small in the distance, making it really small in the middle. And then a lot larger in the foreground. That said, we can have people who slightly avoid the actual center of the road when driving. So I'm going to continue making my brush strokes in the direction of the road. And I'm going to ensure that they're not perfectly thick. That way there's this implication that people are still driving slightly off of that generic pattern area. And it looks like there are still slight markings in the road. Not large ones, not dominant ones. You can also continue to thicken that up as it dries. Thicken that up to a point as it dries, but still try to leave in some brush strokes. Again, it's going to look a whole lot better. We just need to trust in the process and do our layers. We can have it be more thick on the left and right hand side. As we get farther away from tires where they'll actually be. Now we're going to take a couple of steps back because we want to see it more as a whole rather than the individual details. We'll still be using the filbert brush, and we're going to go over this now negative space with this pigment, but we're going to use a very small amount of that paint, and we're going to make our brush fairly dry. So it was damp. I'm wiping off all the excess water on a little painting cloth. I'll grab some of our pigment, wipe off the excess, so that I have an incredibly minimal amount. And then I'll start to roughly tap and drag that on in the background. You can see that it's starting to cover it up just a little bit, but it's still visually notable, but now it's more visually inconsistent. We can tap in horizontally from the mounds on the left and the right hand side. But then I'm also going to rotate my brush so that we get a randomized speckling as well. And you can also move the brush in the general direction of the road to give it a cohesive look with what we have to the left and the right hand side. Starting to work, starting to build it up properly. Taking a little while to get there. This is a bit more steep of an area of road, so it's not going to collect that visually the same way. Head over here. Again, I'm starting on the edge, I'm working my way in, starting on the edge, working my way in. A little bit of a tap and drag. There we go. That looks nice. Now let's brighten up our pigment. And let's add a little bit more blue, just because we are down in an area that will get a little bit of shadow. We'll apply this initially to that mid part of road and have it dip into that left and right hand side. We'll apply it to this edge, same thing. But then also move it in that general direction of road, allowing it to dissipate as you move into the back where there's more shadow. This is going to give us some extra depth, some extra texture. It'll be a bit more dramatic than the reference photo, but I like that actually. There we go. That's beautiful. I like that a lot. Getting there. Slowly getting there. And then again, we want a lot of these strokes in the road to be in the same direction as the road itself. So there are these implied openings. We want to do more left and right hand taps for that. More horizontal tapping and dragging. And then the longer strokes as we approach the edge, but not as dramatic because I don't want the edges to be as bright as they are going to get more shadow anyway. And then very lightly I'm just applying a little bit to the back when I've essentially run out of paint. It's really a process of applying, letting dry, building up with more, and going back and continuing to have fun with that process. Lots of taps. There we go. Going over a couple areas to make them a bit more thick. Here we are, quite a bit closer. That way now you can see some detail. Again, we wanted to establish it as a whole, make sure that it was cohesive, make sure that it worked out with everything on top. And now that we did so, we can just do some touch-ups closer up. grab some extra titanium white, brighten up our previous mixture, yet again go into the areas that we feel like are going to be the highest areas of snow, and we're picking the highest areas because of course they are going to collect the most light, and then we have these little divots that sink down. They don't get that light, and that's why they are a little bit darker. Love painting snow like this. And I feel like despite the fact that I'm from Canada and Ontario, a place a lot of people associate with constant snow, we only really get a good amount for maybe 3-4 months out of the year. So there isn't really that much time to play with it. So I really try to enjoy these ones. February though is typically when we have the most, and that is coming up, so I get to kind of live with this inspiration for a good period of time still. Can see just how slowly building it up really does make a difference. My brush strokes are moving quickly, predominantly just so I keep a good amount of randomization in the application, but there is real thought in between a lot of these taps, and they are fairly purposeful. Trying to build two mounds like this, here and here, with this implied opening area there and an implied opening there. So I'm just trying to apply more highlights to the tops of them right now, with little taps that drag to the left and right. But I don't want it to be too dramatic. And when I want to soften it, I'll just lightly go over the middle area, like that. Again, keeping the edges a little bit darker. And then when I have next to no paint, I'll probably go into the center area, just a myriad of taps. Fill it in very minorly. There we go. Don't have to. Can soften it. I like that too. Doesn't all have to be hyper dramatic, and you can have areas that are softer and then darker and then softer. And you can also take your Mars Black, a little bit of that titanium white you were working with, and re-interject darker areas if you want to. So you aren't stuck. If you've made it really dark or really bright, you can always kind of bounce back and forth, which is nice. Now we'll start working on the left and right hand sides of the road, which of course get smaller as they move towards the back, larger in the foreground simply because of perspective, and a lot of them is snow covered. However, what you can really see in these is a lot of little branches, leaves from fall, and the general color profile of it is kind of a very desaturated burnt sienna. So we'll grab that pigment, we'll do the base layer in that warmer brown, the very rich color, which we will desaturate, and then once that's dry, we can add on all of the snow, some branches, and have fun with that as well. Now, this process is going to begin very simply, again, with that 1/3 inch filbert brush. We'll grab a good amount of our burnt sienna, move that to a clean spot on our palette, grab about an equal mixture of titanium white. This will brighten it, but it'll also start desaturating it, something we do want to emphasize. Then we'll grab that same amount of paint in Mars Black, which will darken it, but again, desaturate it. And that really is our initial prominent goal. You can see that it's warmer than everything else that we have on the palette by quite a bit, but it doesn't stand out in a dramatic way. I'm going to do a little test on my reference photo. A couple of different spots. That actually worked out really well. I want to brighten it slightly, so a hint more titanium white. There we go. And we'll start applying this by just blocking it in. Essentially working little X-shaped patterns back and forth with our brush. Going to walk this all the way into the distance, getting smaller and smaller. There we go. But you'll notice I only really did the top. That's because the top is going to be receiving more light and the bottom more shadows. So for that, we'll grab maybe 1/3. I grabbed significantly more than I intended to. So we'll just make a slightly darker variant of what we currently have. I'm going to mix it right beside our current mixture. That way I can just look back and forth and make sure that it still resembles the initial goal in color. And then we'll work that on the bottom. That'll actually work great. And we'll bring it into the distance, still working it under, and then we'll just get it to be lost essentially right before the end. Then we'll blend the two with that X-shaped pattern, nice and easy. And if you have some brush strokes in there, that's actually not a bad thing at all. We'll grab that same dark pigment to show you that you can begin with either the brighter variant or the darker. Doesn't really matter. Bring it up to about that halfway point. We'll grab as much light pigment as we have, and I might not have enough on my palette, and if I don't, I'm not going to stretch it farther than I can reasonably. I'm just going to mix more. There we go. Blending that up. Grab the rest to finish off the back. And doing this with a little bit of a tap so you get the texture as if there's that foliage hanging to the side and presenting itself. Though, we actually do have some small little leaves and branches still showing. So for those, I'll go to the liner brush, grab that pigment, and I'll just tap on what will be a couple taller remaining plants. This will just be nice diversity. Want a slightly brighter variant, as it'll be higher up. And we're going to add snow to the tops of all of these applications, so don't worry if you feel like it's getting lost or looking a little messy. Right now it is meant to look very messy, but we'll clean that all up soon. There we go, leaving lots of openings for them, just like that. That said, we want a fairly scratchy look inside of this, fairly textured. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a darker variant, and I'll stick with the liner brush here just because I'm not really having issues mixing paint. And I think we're close to what we want. I'm rotating my palette as frequently as I am, by the way, just so that I get different lighting and reflection on it. Acrylic paint is inherently very reflective, and therefore how you hold your palette, where you have your palette in relation to your light, will change how you actually see said paint. But I like that. I'm going to go in to this bottom area here, and we're just going to create the implication of foliage, whether that be little leaves, so taps for open areas and shadow, or we can create elongated stems or grasses, but we essentially just want texture to build snow on top of. So, painting little bits of grass, little taps. areas that connect all of the larger foliage that we painted above on the top. And again, messy really is the goal. That way it looks natural, organic, like it actually fits within the context of the painting. There we go, lots of little taps. It should essentially dissipate as you move towards the bottom because the bottom is inherently darker. Trying to cover quite a bit of the bodies, stems, all of that. That way they're a bit more subtle. And much like everything else, the more range of value you create, the more depth and realism you create. So we're going to go for an even darker mixture. Throw that towards the real bottom. And we can build it up slightly via taps and drags and grass-like effects. There we go. It's a bit of an unintuitive painting process, but I think it'll render you really good results. Not going far back with it, by the way, because we're just not going to see that much contrast in the distance. And here I'm just going through and moving that paint around a little bit. Nothing too dramatic. There we go. I also want to grab a mid version of that pigment. And we'll just do some fallen leaves that are going to be covered in snow towards the side of the road. We will be applying snow on top of them for the most part. So if they look a little too messy or you do too many, don't worry about it. Though I am going to occasionally lead them back into the larger grouping as that'll look natural, though we will also have some strays. There we go. That said, so far from finished. Need to let that dry fully, that way we don't dilute our brighter pigments, and then we'll hop back in with some snow and some nice details. Now, it's been about 15 minutes. Everything is fully dry to the touch. I cleaned my water dish and my brush, that way I don't have any extra burnt umber on them. And now we can go in with some cleaner snow pigments. Now, for that, we'll start with titanium white. I'm going to avoid all of the diluted areas here that also have burnt umber and Mars black, all of that. We just want a good pure titanium white. We'll grab a hint of our ultramarine blue, because of course we do want to be a little cooler, via that we're in the bottom and therefore in a shadowy portion. Hint of Mars black. I'm continuously going back and just adding more titanium white, getting it close to what we had on the road. There we go. But again, maybe a little bit darker. So now I'll take the excess paint off my brush, because it's always hard to work with a brush that just makes paint because it just has too much paint on it. I'll grab that pigment and we'll start working on going over some of this foliage. Now, there's significantly more on the left-hand side than the right-hand side, and we're going to be very aware of that as we work through this, but I actually want to add more to this side than what's presented in the reference photo. I just think it'll look a little bit better. We take these artistic liberties because we have a different vision than what the reference photo might have had, what the original photographer might have had, but it's not going to be a dramatic change. going in. That's a little bit brighter, and you can vary the brightness of these pigments. It'll actually make your applications look much more interesting. But here, you can see that it's actually standing out well because we have that darker background towards the bottom. There we go. And then we get to these larger clusters towards this area, and that's significantly more full of these brighter white applications than the top area. These are a bit more sparse, they're a bit more spread out, but here we have a larger mass to cover up. And so you can see that I'm doing quite a bit, running down the edge, letting it dissipate on my brush, but when we're here in the foreground, while we're leaving openings, we are covering significantly more space. There we go. Let's get you a little bit closer. Now, we also wanted to incorporate markings for grasses and stems, all of that. So we can incorporate some of those. They'll be a bit more linear, typically crossing over one another. Lots coming from this bottom area, and you do want your brush to be nice and damp for this to make the smaller applications. But we can also darken our pigment a little bit, make it a little bit more blue as well. Just grab both of those in very minor amounts. Bounce back and forth. There we go. Make our brush damp. And we can run some of this down to make it look like there are these longer areas that are weighed down by the snow. And again, we move back into the painting as it dissipates. Cover the tops of these. Might as well do a little bit on the other side as well while we have this proper amount of pigment for this area. There we go, just pushing it off into the distance. But again, very wet brush means lots of smaller, very natural applications. And then sparsely, as we get towards the middle, we'll incorporate more of the technique that we used at the top. So a little bit of a drag with a fall to it, but not as much. And then we can incorporate some highlights to the tops of some of these fallen leaves and bring this snow into this area through a slightly horizontal but also lifted stroke, just like that. There we go. Let's head over to the other side. Now from here, we'll grab more of that pigment, and again, where do we start? Typically on the top leaves that are still present. And I like to start up here because it's very detailed work. It's work that's going to stand out more so than the bottom portions. And therefore, we want to get that while we are still mentally very invested. Typically through lots of repetition, it's not that we care less about it as we continue to apply it, but we're not as deeply mentally there. And it makes sense, right? You can only hold that true focus for so long. And I like to ensure that I approach these areas when I'm really there and ready to think about every single little application, right? Then, as we move into the body, more horizontal applications that then dip down, lots of which connecting to each other, and occasional grasses that can come out of the actual bottom area, or out of the middle, out of another area. I try to make the bottom of these grasses more thick, so I go over them a couple of times, or just apply more pressure with my brush where the tops are significantly sharper. And we have them that move to the left and to the right, but the majority of them I like to move in towards the road, so it's opposite on both sides, but it acts as a nice leading line. And of course, we can just drag some of the snow inwards along those edges. Add some snow onto the leaves. Don't have to do that, but it's an extra touch. Here we'll continue connecting through the top until we feel that we've essentially covered the entirety of a larger three-dimensional top. Go over a couple portions numerous times, little taps here and there to show that little protruding areas will stick out. There we go. And we'll create a brighter mixture for some true highlights. Again, get some spots to pop out a little bit better, give us some extra depth, just applying this to the top areas that are going to receive the most amount of light. It's not something I'm applying generously. There we go. Now, something we have to go back and do once this is established is reincorporate a lot of the trees on the left and right hand side that we lost when we painted in the sides, or rather the land that connected to the road, right? So here, back to the liner brush, very simple. We'll grab some of our Mars black paint. We'll grab about an equal mixture of that ultramarine blue, just like so, and then about an equal mixture of titanium white initially. This will create a mid-gray, as you can see, but a cooler one at that. And this will be great for those distant trees, as again, we don't want them to be as stark as what we have in the foreground. So I'm just taking the excess paint off my brush, grabbing that with a damp brush, and we'll bring these down to either inside or behind this newly established edge to the trees. We can also incorporate additional branches, just like that. Again, we want to avoid having things become too visually samey. And the idea here is to really make the background mysterious, lost in a lot of this detail, all of these different trees, but in a subtle way. So our values, our lights and our darks, aren't dramatically different, but there's enough in terms of line work and shape to diversify it greatly. Go back and grab a bit more of this. You can also switch to a smaller liner brush should you want to, and I'm also going to incorporate some a little bit closer to us in the foreground. I'll start connecting some up from inside these to also move upwards. There's a lot of focusing here. Something else you can do is, again, brace your pinky finger to help you eliminate any shake in your hand that may be hindering the process. That said, we are getting towards the end of the lesson, and I would like to say big thank you to everybody for taking the time to do this with me here today. Always love to see that people are dedicated to finishing these and working to improve to be better artists together. I'd also like to say a big thank you to everybody who supports the channel up over on Patreon. The channel is predominantly community funded, and these lessons only happen because of you and your direct support. So thank you for making this lesson happen, as well as the rest of them. And if you are new to the channel, this is your first lesson, up over on Patreon. You can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first one. A bunch of ebooks full of traceables. We have an exclusive Facebook group you can get access to up there. You can also get the traceables and the reference photos for these lessons. So this one in particular, if you want some help with getting the perspective right with your road or the trees, how they get larger, you can find that up there. You can also get the traceable, or rather the reference photo. That'll also be linked in the video description. All of it will be linked in the video description. So lots of fun stuff to check out. And again, it's just a great way to support the channel if you want to do that. But of course, no pressure if you can't at all. That said, again, big thank you to everybody who does. I'm now going back to some titanium whites, or mid-grays as you can see, to rework in some highlights onto the larger branches that we have in here. We just had a lot of darker areas worked in, and I'm trying to balance it slightly with some brights that are aiming to achieve the same thing. Again, a lot of the values are very similar in this space. Nothing's too dark or too bright, and that's why we can have so much detail without it looking overly complicated or overly busy. Though the more I add that, the more I want little trees in those areas as well. So I'll mix up more pigment. Again, we really don't want to get to the point where we're scraping for pigment and not really applying as much as we should be, because then we end up with layers that just look incomplete or unprofessional. Always better to get a bit more paint. Also, I always get asked the question, how do I keep my paints wet on my palette? I don't. The majority of this is dry. I just go back and add more, which, is a little bit unfortunate, but I do work with Winsor & Newton for the majority of my paints, and it's a very affordable paint, so it's not the end of the world if a little bit of it dries. Especially if we get a great piece out of it, right? Though you can also get palettes that you can kind of store and they keep pigment wet. I haven't personally rather had any real experience with them, but seen them advertised quite a few times. Something else you can do is you can spritz your palette with a little bit of water. I don't personally like to do that technique because then it adds water into your pigment, and I already like to add water into my pigment separately, so it throws off the amount of water that I'm adding. I have less control over it, so that's one reason why I don't personally do that, but I also see that done quite a bit, and I don't think it's a bad idea. It just doesn't work well with the way I like to work, because I do like to work with quite a bit of water and am frequently using damp brushes to different degrees. There we go. See, all of those little additions really paying off. Something else we can do at this stage is grab titanium white, and here I'm just trying to grab non-diluted titanium white. Getting a little bit difficult, but I'm sure we will find some. There we go. We'll just move that up here. Get the smallest amount of Mars Black. Maybe a little bit more white. And with this, a little bit of ultramarine blue, we can reincorporate the highlights that we have at the top throughout the trees more. And I try to do this relatively sparingly throughout the process, and will continue to do so right now, just because it's easy to overdo, and often there's a nice balance. Again, we want that gradient from the bright coming down to the dark. And that is still important. Often I like to do this from standing as far back as I can. There we go. You can see a little spot there, there. It's all subtle. It's all very subtle, but it's all meant to be. We do a little bit down here, but not too much. Again, covering small portions of the trees, which we can repaint if we cover too much of. so that's okay. There we go. Get more of this pigment, work it up towards the top. You can also expand your trees to be taller if you want to. Work on that connective area. You can also, again, grab more titanium white, go for something really quite bright, but again, still having hints of both of these. You can work that into the larger opening area down here, because this is where we'll have the most light, in the bottom anyway, in that center, because that's where the trees open. And I'd throw that on the left and right hand side, but just towards the edges, because this area is going to be shadowy. And I'm just applying this to the tops of the mounds that we previously implied with the filbert brush. Using a fairly watery application as well, which makes the semi-transparent and less dramatic than it would have been otherwise. And then if I wanted to be more dramatic, I can just go over it again and continue building from there. There we go. Like that a lot. We'll grab a bit more. And we'll offer that to the left-hand side. And here, remember that we don't have a singular mound of snow like we do kind of in the middle. We have multiple to imply that there's a second area where tires may go through. And it all gets lost in the background. Really like this. You can also take small hints of your Mars Black, Ultramarine Blue, maybe a little titanium white, and work in very tiny branches towards the top. You don't have to, but if you find that in the process of adding detail everywhere else that you want a little bit more up here, that is an option. And if you apply too much, you can cover it up with more titanium white and all of that. So you really don't run any risks, which is nice. That said, I still like to apply it slowly, never really adding too much at one point. And for those of you who are still here, I always like to leave a little keyword in the comment section, or rather give you a keyword that you can leave in the comment section if you make it this far. It's a little kind of badge of honor for making it to the end, showing that you are one of the dedicated few, often only 13% who do make it to the end. And I'll know that you're one of those people. The other people who make it this far will also know. But we need a keyword. Here we are. You know what? I'd love, instead of a keyword this time, to hear about your favorite experience in a snowy scene like this. So whether it be you're growing up and it's your first snowball fight, or maybe you went skiing one time because your climate isn't particularly cold. I think that would be really interesting. And I guess if you just do live in a warmer climate and you've never really been able to experience snow like this, maybe instead you could talk about a place you might want to visit one day. Kind of something on that to-do list, that bucket list. I've, despite painting some tropical scenes, I've never personally been to a tropical setting. And that's something that I think one day will be very fun. Though I get lots of scenes like this. So it's kind of a trade-off wherever you live, right? Climate-wise. You're going to get significantly more of one thing or another, but love to hear about your first experience of snow or place you'd love to go one day. make it a little more personal this time, eh? That's what a lot of these paintings are. Like, we're painting landscapes, but often I think they deliver an idea, a mood, a feeling. They can take us places that we can't go in person, especially times like what we have today, right? So hopefully a lot of these lessons, a lot of these paintings are kind of transformative to you in that way, as they are for me. And you can get a little bit more out of them too. So with that, I really like this. I think it turned out great. Knowing me, I'll probably go back and do little touch-ups over the next week, but with that, hope you had a lot of fun. Hope you learned a lot. You're excited to go out and do your own rendition. Again, you can find the traceables, reference photos, ebooks, exclusive Facebook group, all up over on the Patreon, all of which linked in the video description. I'll also have all of the materials down there. So, with that, I'm never going to stop painting if I don't stop talking. Thank you. I will see you soon with a new painting lesson. Hope you have a lovely Sunday or weekday if you're watching it then. And yeah, as always, stay creative, and I'll see you soon.